Today we're going to spend some time looking at our shadow. We're going to look at impermanence within early Buddhism and indeed within really all of Buddhism to an extent. Impermanence is a basic, important part of the Buddha Dharma, of the Buddhist teaching. But I think many of us may think of it as relatively simple and straightforward, and I'm going to argue in this video that it's not, that it's actually something quite deep and quite difficult. And so we'll get into some of that depth and difficulty coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org, where you can find deeper studies and ways of understanding early Buddhism if you find it difficult. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you'd like to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. The central experiential insight in early Buddhism is that all things change, that all things pass away. It's this central insight that we use to derive all of the rest of the Dharma, if you like. In particular, the idea that life is unsatisfactory comes from the fact that it's always changing, that not only things outside ourselves are changing, but we ourselves are changing. There's no core to us that is unchanging either. Even we change. And we therefore also derive the idea that there is no self. That is to say, there's no essential permanent self, although there may be other ideas. I'll leave that for a separate video. I've done other videos on that. In fact, I'll put a link to one down below about non-self. But the basic idea is that the idea of non-self, that there is no permanent self, again, we derive from this primary understanding and experience that all things change. And I think that for many of us, seeing and hearing this for the 100th time or the 1000th time, it becomes kind of obvious if it wasn't obvious to begin with. We think of it as obvious. We think of it as the kind of thing that is unsurprising, that eventually becomes kind of, if you like, banal, uninteresting. That, yes, of course things change, let's move on to something more interesting and more fruitful and deeper. And so we tend to pass it by. But yet the Buddha himself argued that it's experiencing change directly that helps us to reach a place of global non-attachment to all things. This global non-attachment, which indeed is in its essence awakening itself, comes directly from this awareness of change, of constant passing away, of constant renewal. The Buddha also talks about how we can understand these kinds of truths intellectually, but not emotionally. That is, we assent to the sentence that all things change. We understand it in an intellectual sense that all things change, but we don't really, that understanding doesn't really penetrate very far. It doesn't penetrate into how we hold things emotionally. And part of the problem here, part of what leads us to not really grasping these on a deeper level, is not seeing the extent to which they're true, is only seeing the superficial kinds of change. So for example, we hear that all things change and we think to ourselves that, of course, my bicycle is eventually going to break down and I'm going to have to replace it, or eventually my refrigerator is going to go, or I'm going to need a new roof on the house, or I'm going to change jobs perhaps in the future. And these are, of course, true, and they're part of the aspects of why all things change, but they're relatively superficial. And if we get stuck on those, then we're liable to kind of think that this is a sort of a banal truth and something that we can understand pretty without problem. But many of us don't tend to think about the fact that we ourselves will die, that we ourselves will pass away, that this body that we inhabit will eventually decay into nothing, will rot away. These are more difficult kinds of awarenesses, more difficult kinds of practices. And it, I think, would benefit us a great deal not to run away from our shadow in this case. And I describe this in the way of a shadow because it's just like a shadow continually follows us no matter where we go, and there's no way to get away from it, so too, the fact of change and death is something that simply is impossible to get away from. It's always there. And if we run away from it, if we try to run away from it or try to ignore it, we're not really understanding the depth that change really means. Now, I understand that this kind of contemplation may be difficult for many of you, and indeed we'll get to some more difficult ones for many of us in a moment. And in these kinds of circumstances, of course, it is beneficial to be self-compassionate. We don't necessarily want to overdo our contemplation if we find it exceedingly difficult to do so. And to that extent, we may, let's say, do a practice of looking at these for a few moments, and then perhaps looking away. In the same way that if we have a great pain that we're going through, sometimes it doesn't benefit us to spend too much time contemplating that pain. We contemplate it for a moment and then look away. And over time, perhaps, we can become more used to it, and the reality of the contemplation may soak deeply enough into our minds, into our emotional lives, that we're able to hold it with more of a sense of equanimity. Now, for many of us, or some of us at any rate, the possibility or the certainty of our own passing may not, in fact, be such a big deal. We may understand that at least to an extent emotionally. But still, we can go further. That we can come to an awareness that it's not only ourselves that will pass away, but indeed that all of human civilization will eventually pass away. That all of human civilization is itself temporary, is itself not permanent, is itself subject to change and passing. There's a course out now over on the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies by the great scholar of early Buddhism, Analayo, who discusses climate change. He discusses the way that we can foster the right kind of mental balance in the face of climate change. And one of the things that he looks at and considers and spends time with is this not only possibility, but certainty of the eventual passing of human civilization. Now, he does this, whether or not climate change is actually going to have that effect is not relevant for this particular thought process, this particular way we contemplate this problem. But nevertheless, it's something that is in the back of our minds as a possibility. And even if it isn't a possibility that happens now or in the near future, it is a possibility that will eventually happen sometime. It's not only a possibility, it's a certainty. And indeed, this is something that we have been, or we will be discussing, I should say, over on my Patreon page, where we're instituting, at least for a time, a little book club where we're going to look at the book that Analayo wrote in conjunction with this course. I'll put a link to Analayo's book down below in the show notes if you're interested in following us along and looking at other possibilities of joining us over on Patreon. Take a look at my Patreon page. It's also linked down below. Indeed, climate change has the potential to end human civilization. But even if it does not, we know that everything that we're familiar with, all of the things around us, all of the aspects of human civilization will eventually pass away. Indeed, even the universe itself will come to an end. Now, of course, the ending of the universe is not something that's going to happen for a very, 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 very long time, so it's not the sort of thing that we have to worry about or should worry about at all, in the same way that we have to indeed be concerned about the realities of climate change. And nevertheless, a contemplation of the ending of all things that we know can help us to relax around our ordinary tendency to cling to things in the world, to cling to ideas, ideals, institutions, countries, people in the world, even the entirety of human civilization. Our tendency to cling to that can be assuaged with an awareness that these things also will pass away. There's an expression from it actually originated in Greece in the person of Hippocrates, was then later sort of changed a little bit in ancient Rome, ars longa vita brevis, which in general means art is long and life is short. And this was taken to mean, in later years, that art is somehow eternal. That although our lives are short and we will die, nevertheless, if we put ourselves into some kind of production of beauty or awareness of the greater culture, that will outlive us. That will not only outlive us, but will be in some sense eternal. It will be everlasting. It will be something that doesn't pass away. And an awareness of change leads us to also the awareness that this is not true, that this is a form of delusion, that all art, all culture, all philosophy, all religion, all thought, all beauty will eventually pass away, that everything that humans know about now, there will be some time in the future where nobody is left, indeed nobody is left either at all, or certainly nobody is left who knows anything of them, because things will have changed so completely. And indeed, famously, that includes the Dharma itself. The Buddha said that eventually the Dharma would pass away, that he was one person, one Buddha, who had rediscovered this ancient, in some sense, ancient kind of truth, but that eventually his teaching would decay, that people would forget it, that there would come a time when nobody knew it anymore, and it would have to be rediscovered again. Now, putting aside the question as to whether and when it would ever be rediscovered again, the point is clear, that the Dharma itself will pass away. So all of these things, whether it be thought, philosophy, Dharma, religion, art, all of it, all the things that we ordinarily cling to, even if we don't cling to ourselves in our own bodies, all of these things that we cling to have their own shadows. They all have the shadows extending behind them, which signify their own end at some point, which signify their own decay and coming to an end. And it's through understanding this change, through understanding this eventual passing away, that we can indeed relax around the kinds of clinging to these which we're all prone to. And indeed, the Buddha himself talked about the Dharma as a raft. That the Dharma is supposed to be getting us from here to the other side of the river, at which point we should leave it behind once we become awakened, that we're no longer supposed to cling to it. And I think an awareness of the Dharma as something that passes away can help us get to that kind of stage of mind. The notion that all things change may seem simple, but in fact, when we look at it deeply enough, we begin to see that it's not simple at all. That it's something that we're ordinarily tending to either not look at deeply enough or tending to run away from. Running away from our shadows, running away from the shadows of the things that we find good in the world. But all of it will come to an end. And it would be important, I think, now to look at an earlier video that I did on the three characteristics or aspects of existence. That is, change, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self, which are really the heart of the Buddha Dharma and its most deep awareness and teaching. So take a look at that. I've put it on the screen now. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And all of you, be well.